The confidence Israel acquires from overwhelming support amongst the diaspora is key. What happens to public policy and statements if they lose that support, or if it is much reduced and seen, in fact, as an outlier? So, I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Cohen back to Sheffield today, who will open up some stories of why young Jewish people have had it with Israel. Robert is currently chair of Amos Trust, which does so much good educative work on Palestine and supports a group which I'm sure lots of us have come across. We Are Not Numbers, who tell such amazing stories of people that are behind the statistics that we are bombarded with every day. For many years, Robert's been a very effective blogger and microblogger, standing out as an observant Jew who defends Palestinians. Please give Robert a very warm Sheffield welcome.
Thank you very much, Johnny, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. I really was expecting nobody to be here, but please watch the football actually. And based on the previous matches that I've seen, nothing really happens until after the 90th minute in the evening game, so you're not going to miss anything. Let me just give a bit more introduction about myself, just building on what Johnny said before we dive into my research findings. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Theology and Religious Studies Department at King's College London. Before starting my PhD research, I completed an MA at Lancaster University in conflict resolution and peace studies, where I focused on the Israel-Palestine conflict. You probably would have noticed that I didn't solve it while I was there. But it's also where I began my academic research into UK Generation Z Jewish descent on Israel. Gen Z, if you're not familiar with the term, is the age demographic following millennials. So Gen Z were born from around 1995 to around 2005. You can probably tell I'm definitely not Gen Z. I grew up in South London, where my family were members of the Reformed Synagogue in Bromley. My interest in Israel-Palestine began when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Manchester in the mid-1980s. And it was the first Palestinian Intifada, which broke out in Gaza in December of 1987, which began my own personal journey to Palestinian solidarity. As Johnny was saying, I wrote a blog for about 10 years, which looked in particular at how UK Jewish institutions spoke about Israel and Zionism, and those blogs were regularly picked up by other websites like Modern Advice and Pathos in the United States. I'm now based in Leeds, where I'm a member of Sinai Reformed Synagogue, but as Johnny said, I'm also chair of Amos Trust, and we have a number of partners both in Gaza and in the West Bank. So that's me. What about the people that I'm studying? If you look across the Atlantic to the biggest diaspora Jewish community in the world, the United States, there's been plenty of evidence of a generational divide over Israel, and that's certainly been clear since last October, where you began to see very high profile and very social media friendly protests taking place that were calling for an immediate ceasefire to the war in Gaza. And if I had the slides available, I'd be showing you an amazing picture of the Statue of Liberty with at the bottom of it hundreds of mostly young Jewish people. I'm glad some people remember that from last November. Underneath the statue with huge banners saying ceasefire now. And then there was another enormous protest that took place in Grand Central Station, also in New York, but again had a lot of sort of visible impact just because of the numbers of people there and the visual impression that it actually made of taking over what's, if you know Grand Central Station, it's an enormous grand concourse of the railway station. The two main organisations behind those events have been Jewish Voice for Peace, which began life in the late 1990s, and if not now, which got started after the 2014 Gaza war. Here in the UK, where the Jewish community is much, much smaller, we've seen more cross-generational protests since last October, typified by the makeup of the Jewish bloc, which has been taking part in the national demonstrations for Gaza in London. And here you don't see everyone wearing the same T-shirt and looking the same age. Instead, you see multiple Jewish organisations, some quite new, others long-standing. Some of the key organisers have been on the scene for decades, others have just come on board. So the story in the UK is different, I think, to the story in the United States in many ways, and for a variety of reasons, and we might get into that later on. There certainly have been demonstrations that have been organised and attended predominantly by younger Jews. Sorry, I'm just referring to what you would have seen in the photographs, but there were young Jewish protesters at London railway stations as well. Some of you might recall, certainly last November. And also vigils and protests that took place around Westminster. And you'd often see these younger Jews wearing traditional Jewish prayer shawls or a kippah on their head. And often they would make use of traditional Jewish prayer as well, notably the Kaddish prayer, which is said to remember the dead. And that was often a feature of their protests. So stepping back from the immediate moment, and it's a very significant moment, what I want to give you this evening is an insight into a section of Generation Z British Jews who are now typically aged between about 20 and 30 years old, and who are expressing dissent over Israel and Zionism. What do they think? What is it that's influencing their thinking? What journey have they been on? And what might it mean for the future? Now, to be clear, I'm not making any specific claim for how representative they are of their Jewish age group overall, or of the total Jewish UK population. That's not the purpose of my research. What we already know from data produced by Jewish institutions themselves is that this segment of young Jews is growing as a demographic. According to the United Jewish Israel Appeal, which funds many of our Jewish youth groups in the UK, and also from survey data gathered by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, we can see that younger Jews in the UK are becoming less emotionally connected to Israel and Zionism than their parents or their grandparents. In carrying out my research, I was particularly interested in young Jews who had grown up within mainstream Jewish spaces. And by that I mean that their families belonged to synagogues. Some of them went to Jewish day schools, both primary and secondary. Many of them attended Jewish youth movements, and the majority of them went on tours of Israel when they were about 15 or 16 years old, that were organised either by their school or by the youth clubs that they were members of. In other words, they are highly Jewishly connected. They're not marginal to the mainstream Jewish community, they are in fact the products of the mainstream Jewish community. The survey that I ran last year was completed by around 55 people. They were self-selecting, as were the 23 people that I interviewed at length. The purpose was to understand this segment on their own terms, rather than through the assumptions and the prejudices that are often levelled against young Jews dissenting over Israel by the very people that they're criticising. Unless we understand this demographic better, how will anyone be equipped to respond to it in a relevant rather than a defensive way? My survey participants have come from modern Orthodox backgrounds, typically from United synagogues across the UK, from Masorti synagogues, and from Reform and Liberal synagogues. I didn't speak to Jews from ultra-Orthodox communities, Haredi or Hasidic communities, as I think that's a different story and a different religious and political dynamic, and that wasn't what I wanted to explore. So my research participants were raised Jewishly within very pro-Israel environments, where belief in the centrality of Israel to Jewish self-understanding is the dominant narrative. And as many of you will know, I'm sure, Zionist thinking is woven through Jewish institutions, by which I mean synagogues, schools, youth groups and so on, and indeed community representative bodies like the Board of Deputies. Now, it may be more or less politically liberal in its expression, but it's always there and always a central theme of Jewish concern and self-understanding. Rather than thinking of it as a support for an overt political ideology or a belief in a God-given right to the land, it's probably more accurate to think of Zionism within UK Jewish spaces as a kind of cultural, religious, historical outlook, which taken together creates a paradigm, a way of seeing the world, which marginalises or at worst denies Palestinian experience. It's a way of understanding recent Jewish history, in particular the Holocaust, which then makes the state of Israel become an existential necessity for Jewish safety and survival. As a result, Zionism is seen as a project of national revival and return to the safety of an ancient Jewish homeland, rather than an exercise in 19th and 20th century settler colonialism. I wanted to study Gen Z young Jews who have grown up within this Zionist paradigm, because I think it will shed most light on where things might be heading for organised Jewish life in the years and the decades to come. If this segment of a Jewish generation is breaking its emotional ties to Israel and Zionism, I think that's far more significant than if less connected Jews are doing so. It points towards the possibility of highly significant change in how Jews and Jewish communities think about themselves, their heritage, their relationship to other faith communities, and of course to the state of Israel, where, we should not forget, around half the global Jewish population now lives. Let me cut to the chase and give you my major finding up front from the data that I've collected. This is certainly a story about politics. It's also about values and about how the people I'm studying are choosing to read their own collective history. But essentially, I've come to see this as a debate, perhaps a battle, about the nature and meaning of Jewish identity in the first quarter of the 21st century. In other words, what should it mean to be Jewish? It's a battle over the interpretation of Jewish values and Jewish historical experience in the light of what has happened to the Palestinian people since 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel. The young people I've been speaking to are very clearly committed to their sense of Jewish belonging, and they want and expect that connection to remain strong in the years to come, despite their views on Israel. So their sense of Jewishness is not peripheral to their Palestinian solidarity, it's actually at the heart of it. Indeed, one could say that they are attempting to reimagine and reshape what it means to be Jewish in the light of their Palestinian empathy. I think most of you here will know that Jewish opposition to Zionism is nothing new. In fact, it's as old as modern political Zionism itself, which emerged in the mid-19th century in Europe. There were both Jewish religious and secular objections to Zionism long before 1948. The religious objections stretched from orthodox to progressive strands of Jewish thinking and practice. Secular objections were typically from the Jewish radical left, but not exclusively. Moderate political opinion within the Jewish world also saw Zionism as a threat to Jewish acceptance in the diaspora. So what's different about today's generation that I've been looking at? One part of the explanation for what's happening with this segment of Generation Z Jews is simply the recent history of Israel-Palestine during their lifetimes. The lives of my research cohort appear to have mapped across a very bleak political trajectory on the Israel-Palestine situation. The failures to find a political solution to the situation over the last 30 years are without doubt one of the key explanations for the emergence of the dissent that I'm now researching. The Oslo Accords were signed in 1993 by Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, brokered by the United States, and the Accords set in motion a peace process which aimed to give the Palestinians self-determination within the Palestinian territories occupied by Israel in 1967. The agreement generated huge optimism in the mid-1990s, although it also had severe Israeli and Palestinian critics, some of whom were determined to derail it. But by the turn of the 21st century, when my research participants were being born, it was clear that the peace process was in severe trouble. Without getting into any the detail, let me just remind you about Palestinian suicide bombings during the Second Intifada, the building of the separation wall that skirts in and out of the West Bank, the ever-growing expansion of Israeli settlements on the West Bank, the Gaza wars since 2008, the most serious before 2023 being the one in 2014, and the succession of ever more right-wing Israeli governments and the collapse of the left within Israeli politics. While the grandparents of my interviewees were shaped by their memories of the 1967 Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the generation of Jews that I've been studying have only known an Israel expanding its settlements of the West Bank and the periodic wars on Gaza. As a result of the failures of the peace process we've seen in the UK over the last quarter century, the emergence of organised Jewish-led dissent over Israel. In the early 2000s, we saw Jews for Justice for Palestinians begin their work. In 2005, an organisation called Judas got going, which took inspiration from the radical Jewish leftist tradition of 19th century and early 20th century Europe. And then in 2007, we had independent Jewish voices. They were formed and led typically by Jewish intellectuals and academics. All of these groups were operating on the margins of the formal Jewish community and directly critiquing Jewish institutions such as the Board of Deputies for its unnuanced and uncritical support for Israeli governments. But for my research group, where things get interesting is with the emergence in 2011 of an organisation called Yachad. It's a Hebrew word meaning together. Yachad was and is a liberal Zionist group critical of the post-1967 occupation of Palestinian land. Now, rather than operating on the outside of the formal Jewish community, Yachad's strategy has been to try and change attitudes on Israel from within the mainstream Jewish world. It set out to work with, rather than against, Jewish institutions, including local synagogues. And for a great many of my research cohort, Yachad was their entry point into the politics of Israel-Palestine. The majority of those I spoke to and surveyed had connections to Yachad in some way as teenagers. And several of the people I interviewed told me how Yachad's campaigns and organised tours of the West Bank were for them the beginning of a journey towards a far more radical understanding, an understanding of the politics which actually went far beyond what Yachad itself was willing to say or do. In fact, one of my participants, one of my interviewees, I remember described Yachad as the gateway drug. It was the thing that got you into something that was a bit more serious. In 2018, we saw the creation of Na'amod. It's another Hebrew word, this time meaning to stand up. In its initial formation, Na'amod did not take a specific position on Zionism or two states or boycotts or the use of the word apartheid, but acknowledged that its members held a range of views on these issues. It was deliberately trying to create a broad tent of Israel dissent, which could include liberal versions of Zionism. What Na'amad was willing to do was directly criticise Jewish institutional positions, including those of many of the youth movements which Na'amadniks had themselves grown up within. And they did this by asserting their own understanding of Jewish values and Jewish ethics. The key point I want to draw out here is the way in which Jewish dissent over Israel within the UK over the last 20 years has moved from the margins of the formal Jewish community to those who have actually grown up at the heart of those Jewish institutions. Okay, let me try and get a little bit more specific for you. The water. What I was going to now do is show you some charts which give you a flavour of what the people I've been researching about have been saying to me in terms of key issues on Israel-Palestine. And I'll talk you through it though, and I think you'll quickly see how the opinions that are being expressed to me have moved well beyond mainstream Jewish outlooks and opinions, including those held by liberal organisations like Yachad. So when I offered them the statement, Israel has tried its hardest to make peace with the Palestinians, 82% of my respondents strongly disagreed, and a further 11% disagreed. When given the statement, the mainstream Jewish community is in denial about what's happened to the Palestinians, I saw around 90% either agreeing or strongly agreeing with that statement. It was also clear that they don't believe that a two-state solution is the only way to bring peace to the conflict. Well over 60% appear to think that other solutions should be considered and might be better. I found the next finding particularly interesting. It shows the ability of the individuals that I'm studying to hold together the complexity of the history that they've inherited. For the majority of my survey respondents, it's perfectly possible to understand that Zionism was a national liberation movement for Jews and a response to anti-Semitism in Europe, while also seeing that it had been a settler colonial project for the Palestinian people. They are willing and able to hold both of these understandings of Zionism and Jewish history simultaneously. Another very revealing finding, which in my PhD write-up will probably form a whole chapter, was about Holocaust remembrance. Nearly 80% of my survey respondents think that we need to find ways of remembering the Holocaust which create empathy towards others, including Palestinians. Now you can see this as a reaction against the dominant role that Holocaust remembrance now has in justifying both the existence and the behaviour of the State of Israel. Just over half my survey respondents said that they were happy to show their activism in support of Palestinians with Jews and with non-Jews. However, 43% prefer to express their Palestinian solidarity within specifically Jewish organised and led spaces. And I asked those who had said that why they held that view. 76% said that it was because they saw their protest as part of their Jewish identity. But we should also note that 50% of them said they did not like the anti-Semitism that they'd seen within the wider Palestinian movement. Another very significant finding from the research has been the importance of face-to-face meetings with Palestinians, either in the UK or typically in the West Bank. And if I had the slide, you'd see that nearly all of my survey respondents had actually had that opportunity. And for 80% of them, that encounter was either important or very important to them. And this came through very strongly in my interviews where being able to see the situation up close on the ground and to hear and speak to Palestinians face to face had an absolute transformational impact on their outlook. One of the major research themes of my study has also been to understand the relationship between the Jewish descent that I'm seeing within this 20 to 30 age group and the fact that they're obviously part of a global demographic called Generation Z. In other words, how does their Jewishness interact with their Gen Z-ness? And by examining what we know about Generation Z's values, priorities and concerns, we can see how being part of this generation might be influencing my own Jewish cohort. There appear to be overlaps and intersections at play, along with a bigger generational picture, which may explain why my research participants are thinking the way that they are, particularly in relation to Palestinian solidarity. As we've seen, Gen Z were born roughly between 1995 and 2005. They have grown up in a world in which the internet has become all pervasive, and the internet is where they learn about the world, where they form opinions and where they make connections with other like-minded people. The dominant events in their lifetime have been the global financial collapse of 2008 and its social and economic aftermath, the realisation of impending climate catastrophe, and the social lockdowns caused by COVID. Gen Z has also come of age during the years that saw the rise of the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movements, which have emphasised cultural, structural and institutional modes of discrimination, all with deep historical roots. I would also suggest that the current Israel-Hamas war will turn out to be another defining global event for this generation in terms of how they interpret world events and geopolitics. Now, studies have shown, plenty of studies have shown, that Gen Z value diversity and social justice within a whole new global context. In particular, they are said to be searching for authenticity linked to ideas of honesty and believability. My research participants appear to be exhibiting a willingness to see Palestinians as more than just the other, meaning potential or real enemies to Jewish interests. As part of Gen Z, this may be an example of their peer group's ability to accept different kinds of people and see the experience of the Palestinian people as a matter of racial and social justice rather than competing national claims between Jews and Arabs. When asked if they had ever witnessed what you would now think of as anti-Palestinian racism by Jewish institutions or organisations, 83% of them said that they had seen such racism. This understanding of Israel and Palestine within a racial framework of injustice may explain other political positions that my research participants seem to hold. It seems that this rights-based framing of the conflict in recent years has won significant acceptance among my research participants. When offered the statement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign is a legitimate form of protest in support of Palestinian rights, it was agreed or strongly agreed by more than 80% of my respondents. A further statement, which said our Jewish community leaders in the UK need to take seriously the human rights reports into Israel's use of apartheid policies and practices, was agreed or strongly agreed by 90% of the respondents. So my Jewish Gen Z cohort is viewing the Israel-Palestine conflict as a justice issue rooted in a lack of equality and structural unfairness towards Palestinians, rather than a battle between Jews and Arabs over who has the moral or stronger political claim to the land. Gen Z are also sceptical about institutions and disillusioned with what they have inherited from their elders. The central placement of Israel and Zionism into contemporary Jewish life by the Jewish institutions which have raised them may be one such inheritance which my informants are rejecting. Their peers in general are also said to have an unerring capacity for sniffing out hypocrisy and a commitment to keeping their eye on the authentic. The ethical dissonance described by my interviewees within their own Jewish communities in relation to Palestinians looks to be an example of sniffing out hypocrisy that so offends their generation. My research cohort could also be benefiting, or perhaps suffering, from a double dose of ethical sensibilities, thanks to the combination of their peer group Gen Z outlook and their Jewish community upbringing, which has fostered a love of ethics and values. A further significant finding I've made, which links again to Gen Z, is the correlation between queer sexual identity and Palestinian empathy and solidarity. If we add the data from my informants showing those identifying as lesbian, gay or bisexual, which was 35%, to the 25% that describe themselves as mainly straight, we reach 60% who are identifying as non-heterosexual or queer, to use the umbrella term that they prefer. That's incredibly high, even for Generation Z in general, which is already the most queer identifying generation ever. So there is something about queer sexuality that then informs a queer political outlook within my Jewish research participants. Now this is one of my research findings that I'm still trying to understand, and I need to gather further data about it, but it's undoubtedly noteworthy. I suspect it's something about experiencing prejudice and marginality, both as a Jew and through sexual orientation, which is then generating a supercharged sensitivity to other victims of prejudice and marginality. And for Gen Z Jews, Palestinians are the obvious additional candidates. I want to bring this part of the evening to a close now, so we've got some time for comment and questions. So where is all this heading? And will what's happening to Gaza since October be a significant long-term factor? I don't believe we are about to see the collapse of support for Israel and Zionism within Anglo-Jewry. However, the fracturing of the Zionist consensus is well and truly underway. The awful events that began on the 7th of October and are still going on are likely to be a catalyst for the trends that I've been describing within the Jewish community. That certainly happened after the Gaza wars of 2008, 9 and 2014, both here and in the United States. So it can only be more so after the events that we're seeing now that are way more awful than anything we've seen before. The most important influence on what happens here will be what happens on the ground in Israel-Palestine. The worse the situation becomes, and the more the democratic deficit grows between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, the deeper the fractures here will become within the UK Jewish community. And the greatest and most observable divide will be generational, for the reasons that I've set out tonight. If this is the direction of travel, and to be honest, I'm deeply pessimistic about the situation on the ground in Israel-Palestine, reaching any truly just resolution anytime soon, then things will change here. Existing Jewish institutions, synagogues, youth movements, schools, representative bodies like the Board of Deputies will need to decide if they're willing to adapt or risk increasing irrelevance and the loss of future pools of leadership talent. However, Gen Z may also have their own ideas about the future of Jewish institutions. Rather than adapt or take over the leadership of existing organisations, they may well choose to create their own new Jewish spaces, and there are signs that that's already taking place. My prediction is that we will see over time a change in who gets to speak on behalf of Anglo-Jewry, and an understanding among the public in general and politicians, something which Jews ourselves have long known, and that's that we are a community with many views and many opinions, and we like nothing more than to argue with each other about those opinions. I'll stop there and let you sort of have thoughts about any comments that you want to make about anything I've said, or any questions or clarifications that you'd like. But thank you very much for listening.